So welcome to vegetable garden planning. I'm so glad that we could talk about this because I think a lot of times people just go out and start throwing stuff in the garden without a plan. And I think you'll have a lot more success if you sit back and think about what it is you actually want to do in the garden and what you want to accomplish. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So first, I want you to think about what are your goals in the garden? What are you trying to accomplish, and what are you wanting to do? And it can take the form of lots of different things, and this helps you decide how much you're wanting to produce and how much you're wanting to produce at one time. So, are you just gardening for fun to have a little bit of extra produce in the season? Having that seasonal flavor like those homegrown tomatoes or cucumbers that are better from the store? Or are you wanting to do stuff like food preservation, canning and freezing and drying to have some, a little bit for the winter and other seasons, or even fill the pantry? Like how much of your own food are you wanting to grow? And that can really dictate how much you want to plant. And then also when you're planting it, because if you're just having seasonal flavor, you want to spread your planting, throughout the planting season so that then you can do succession. And we'll talk about that so that you don't have 200 carrots that are ready to eat all at once, but you have them throughout the season. Whereas if you're wanting to do preservation, if you're wanting to can or freeze or dry, you might want to have a bigger batch of stuff ready all at once. So you might want those 200 carrots all together at the same time. And then, of course, there's sharing with neighbors and there's donating. A lot of food pantries will take fresh produce, especially if you reach out to them beforehand to ask them what they will take. They don't want you to show up with like 100 pounds of oversized zucchini. But a lot of food pantries and soup kitchens, they struggle to get fresh food. So that's a good place to look as well in order to share your extra produce. And there's even programs called Grow a Row or Plant a Row where you're actually encouraged to grow extra produce to donate. So you can check out stuff like that as well. So whenever we're talking about developing a garden site, the planning goes into sort of figuring out where you're going to put the garden. And that can really help with success going down the road because you make sure it's right for the plants, but you also make sure it's right for you. And so you want to make sure the site is accessible. And that can mean a few different things. It can mean, if you have limited mobility, is it easy for you to get to? Is it near your home? Or even as you build it, do you have beds that are easily accessible to you? Does it meet your needs? Is it big enough to grow what you want? Is it small enough for you to manage? You have to think about those things. Do you need a huge garden if you're not going to be able to manage it and use it effectively? So you want to size it just right. You want to be able to grow what you want to grow. You also have to think about, does it have adequate light for the crops you want to grow? And we'll talk about that in a second. But that can be a struggle for people. If you have a lot of shade in your yard, you have a lot of trees, it might not be good for things like tomatoes and peppers that need a lot of light. So you have to think about what you can grow. And then you also have to think about, do I have access to water? Do I have an outside source of water? Usually we have some sort of access to water outside our home, but not everyone does. And this is also important if you're not gardening at home, but maybe you have a community garden or you're using a vacant lot. Here in Omaha, you can actually contact the city planning department and they will let you use vacant city lots for gardening. There's just no water. So you have to figure out, make sure you have access to water is a big thing. So we talked about light availability, and there are things that we can grow without light. There's a general rule of thumb that we will say, is not exactly, set in stone for everything. But the good thing to remember is if you grow it for a fruit or a root, it typically needs full sun because that takes a lot of energy to produce, and you need all the sunlight you can get. And so full sun means it's at least 6 hours of full direct sunlight on those plants. So tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, potatoes, those things that grow a fruit or a root, they need that full sun. Typically, if it's a leaf or a stem crop, you can get by with a little bit less light. So lettuce, leafy greens, Those kinds of things you can actually grow without as much light. You can do a few less hours of full sun for those plants, or even partial sun. And so I found these graphics online, and of course you have to take online things with a grain of salt. I found this little shade tolerant plant list, and then I got to looking at it. It was like, no, garlic needs full sun, and potatoes, the potatoes, carrots, and beets, they're full, they're root crops. They need a little bit more sun, but they were spot on with some of the leafy herbs and the leafy greens, that they don't really need full sun. You can get by with a little bit less. So if you have that shade, you can plant those versus having the tomatoes and peppers. Those will need more light. So we can talk about planning our design of the garden. The traditional old-fashioned way is to prepare it in the ground, where we're doing rows. We might prepare a big bed, and we have that open, and then we have all the walkways are either tilled up, or we have put down compost. It's actually, we're really recommending folks not to till the soil, so to reduce tillage as much as possible. And so this method is a little more difficult to do. We have a larger space to maintain, but we have less infrastructure. We don't have to build beds. We don't have to do that kind of planning. And we can typically grow larger crops. But that tillage on the soil to prepare those beds is typically a lot harsher on the soil, and actually over time will reduce the quality of the soil and our yields in the crops. If you're doing beds or raised beds, that's a little bit better, because what we can do is we can create raised beds that are easier accessed. You can raise them a foot or a few feet off of the ground. That makes it so that you don't have to bend over as much in order to get the produce out of that bed, or to plant, or to manage that. We can also have more intensive spacing because we don't have those big rows between the crops, and so we can plant everything a little bit closer. And you can do beds even if they're not raised beds, and I do this. They're in-ground beds where I have just a walkway between, like a 4x8 bed that I've prepared, and I just use a wood chip mulch between them, and they're not raised. They don't have a lumber frame, but you can use lumber. You can use like landscape bricks. You can use lots of different things to build those beds if you want. Or you can do containers. Maybe you have a small space, you're in an apartment, you don't have an outdoor garden. There's lots of stuff that you can grow in containers. And so you want to think about, what is best for you and what is going to work for you when you plan out your garden, because you want it as easy to manage as you can, while also producing what you want to produce. Now we're going to talk about briefly selecting plants, and we want to choose plants that fit your needs. It often, I've heard people say, well, I grew this plant, and then I didn't really like it. Like I didn't, I just planted beets because that's what I had seeds for, and then I don't really like beets. What do I do with them? I love beets, so you can send them to me. But you want to choose plants that fit your need. They should be able to grow in the area. So you want to look at, and we'll talk about more like seasonality and making sure you have a long enough growing season. But in Nebraska, we're here, it's, it gets cold, we can't have tropical plants, etc. And those lines are blurring a little bit more as we're, online. Like people can order from anywhere in the world, and you have to do a little bit of research to know that, yes, this is something we can grow in our area. We also want to look for disease-resistant plants, if you can find those, especially in those things like tomatoes and some of the cucumbers and squash that get a lot of diseases. You can now find disease-resistant varieties that help keep the health of the plant longer, but also reduce the need to do any sort of treatment. And so I have also on here that there are 4 terms that we typically hear when we think about plants or seeds, and those are heirloom, open pollinated, hybrid, and GMO. So when you're looking at the seed packet, typically you'll see the word heirloom or hybrid. And an heirloom just means that it's an open pollinated variety, meaning that that you can save the seed year after year, and don't have to do like a hand crossing in order to get those plants. An heirloom is just that has sort of a history, a long story. A hybrid is something that someone has taken, a bunch of different plants with with really cool characteristics that they're looking at. They cross them together and they get this seed. And the nice thing is a lot of the newer hybrid varieties have disease resistance, whereas most of the heirlooms don't. And so that's the thing that you look for there. And then we see this non-GMO label, and especially on seed packets these days. And that's something we really don't have to worry about as home gardeners, because you can't buy GMO seeds at all for a home garden. You can't buy them as a home gardener. They don't make them. And most of the things we grow in a home garden don't have a GMO equivalent. They don't exist. And so you don't have to seek out specific seeds that are non-GMO, because all home garden seeds are non-GMO. There are no GMO garden seeds that exist, and you wouldn't be able to buy them without signing a contract if they did. So now we're going to start talking about the actual coming up with a planting plan. So we want to plan for multiple harvests, like I said, especially if you're eating throughout the season. And we're going to talk about how to count and start seeds at the appropriate time. We also are going to talk about not rushing, because we all want to run out and we all want to plant everything whenever it's time, whenever frost is done. But we really have to look at the key soil and air temperatures for whenever it's time to plant. And we should look more at that than at the calendar. And I know a lot of people said, oh, well, it was St. Patrick's Day, I need to plant my potatoes, or it's Mother's Day, I'm going to plant my tomatoes. And those really aren't good indicators. It's really looking at the weather indicators for the freeze and frost and knowing when those dates are, and also looking at the soil temperature. And David's going to talk about that a little bit more later. And so we can use these things like succession planting to harvest in a longer period. And we can also use crop rotation to increase our yield and reduce our pests. And we're going to talk about those things a little bit. Also, interplanting. And this is something a lot of people will use the term companion planting. And we don't like to use that term because there's not a lot of research to support a lot of the claims that are made saying, oh, well, this plant reduces diseases in that plant, or this plant loves this plant. But we can plant things together to make good use of our space, and also as we do succession planting. So an example would be planting an early season cool crop, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then as the season warms up, we're ready to plant our warm season crop. We can plant it right in there. And so those plants are still growing right in the same space together. As the cool season crop finishes, the warm season crop will then take over and grow and fill in the space. And so we can also mix with different growth habits, like vining crops that we run up a trellis. We can plant around the base of them, etc. And so we can really plan to make a big use of our space. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we talk about those warm and cool season crops that we can mix and match to really get the use out of our space. So just some examples. So in this garden on the left, they've sown lettuce early in the season, and then they also planted broccoli. So the lettuce grows really fast and fills in the area, and the broccoli is much more slower growing. So the lettuce will be done before the broccoli really gets to a huge size. And so we'll be finishing the lettuce harvest just as the broccoli fills in, and we're using that space really effectively. And then on the right side, we have the classic, which is Three Sisters, based on Native American tradition, where there's corn and beans and squash all growing together, and they all contribute something. The bean or the corn provides a pole for the pole bean to grow up. The bean is providing nitrogen into the soil, and the squash is providing weed suppression because it's filling in the ground space. And then up top there, that's a farmer growing tomatoes in a high tunnel, and you can see bands of lettuce across. And so they're making use of that space. And those tomatoes will actually shade that lettuce and help make it live longer, because it will keep it from getting as warm from the sun, which the lettuce will not like. So I just want to talk a little bit about crop rotation. This is something that we talk about, and it can be hard in home gardens because we don't have as much space in order to really take care of that, because we have to have space to rotate the crops around. But really, it can help reduce disease and insect pressures because we're not putting the same thing in the same place every year. where we're feeding the same diseases and insects in that soil and in that area. It makes not as much of a difference in a small home garden area as like a huge farm field, but it can still be useful. It can also help us by controlling how we use the nutrients in the soil. We have crops that produce nitrogen. We have crops that use a lot of nitrogen. We have crops that use a lot of other nutrients. And so if we rotate things around, we can balance our soil nutrient usage. And also can help control weeds. If we use like a big bushy crop that fills in the space, it suppresses all the weeds. So then the next year when we plant something that isn't as big, we've killed out a lot of the weed seeds and things in that area. So for diseases, we might want to rotate by vegetable crops. And so we have things like, if you think about those things that are related, like the big ones is the Solanaceae family. So that's tomatoes, potatoes, pepper, eggplant. Group them all together and move them around the garden. Every 3 to 4 years, they're not planted in the same place. Other big ones, all the cucumbers, melons, pumpkins, squash, if you can keep them together and rotate them around where they're not in that same space for like 3 or 4 years, that would be good. Then we also think about, the nutrient use. And so we have crops that use a lot of nutrients like nitrogen. So like corn and garlic, melon, squash, they use a lot of nitrogen. We have crops that produce nitrogen because they have bacteria on their roots, called peas, beans, etc. And then we have crops that don't really use a lot of nutrients. So if we put those in a rotation, we can sort of, produce nitrogen in the soil and then have crops that feed on that nitrogen. In my own garden, I grow beans 1 year, and then they come out in the fall, as it frosts, and then it's fall, it's the time to plant garlic. So I follow my garlic right after my beans. And so that's part of my rotation because I know that garlic likes the nitrogen that the beans produce. Succession planting, as I mentioned, extends the harvest through the multiple seasons. It makes a good use of space. And there are really 3 types. So there's planting those warm and cool season crops together. So I start off with a lettuce or a leafy green, and then I move to a tomato or beans, and then maybe I go back to a leafy green or radishes in the fall, and I can get 2 to 3 crops in one space, and even interplanting them to make sure that they might overlap a little bit. Relay planting is what you want to do if you don't need all of one thing at once. So maybe I'm planting radishes. I don't need 200 radishes at once. So maybe I go out every week and I sprinkle like 10 or 12 radish seeds in the garden, and then I go back the next week or 2 weeks later and sprinkle 10 more, and so that they're always sort of coming into the garden. And then we can do maturity planting, where maybe I plant a tomato that takes 60 days to produce, and a tomato that takes 80 days to produce. And then I can have those different harvests at different times, but I planted at the same time. And you can look at those planting dates, and David will talk about that in a bit. So those cool season crops, like I said, a lot of them are the leafy greens, peas, radish, onions. You can do cold crops. Probably the best ones for early are cabbage. And then warm season crops, those would come in after frost. So tomatoes, beans, cucumber, squash, etc. And then we can follow back up, and in late July and August, if you're in Nebraska, you can plant those cold crops like broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts. And you can do a little bit later for like the leafy greens, so that then they grow into fall, and you have those crops throughout the season. So now I'm going to turn it over to David, and he's going to talk about when to plant.
Thank you, John, for turning this over. It's really important to make some good decisions when it comes to planting, especially in relationship to our soil temperature and our frost-free dates. So we do have a number of factors that we can work with and manipulate. And like John said, we need to think more of knowing what the soil temperatures are, the frost-free date, the air temperatures are, versus a specific calendar date, because we have so much variability here in Nebraska, and our big cold snap was more proof that we can get some extreme cold. We can get those late snowstorms that come through. So the calendar date is a good general rule of thumb, but if we want to take it another level to help reduce some damage, that would be even better. Okay, next slide. Ready for the next slide, John? Okay. So soil temperatures, it's really good to know when to apply and to know that each crop has a minimum soil temperature to germinate and to grow. We have we have crops that we're going to grow indoors as transplants and then move them out. So we have to plan ahead for those as well. But we need to know that cold soils, even though it may feel warm outside in the air temperature, our soils are still going to probably be cool. And if we're planting seeds that require a warmer soil temperature than what it already is now, you either stop germination or the seed rots, or if you're putting transplants in when it's too cold and you've done nothing to help warm that soil up in some form or fashion, then the plant gets stunted. That's one question that we get about people that have planted tomatoes and peppers. Like John said, the solanaceous crops are the most popular. We plant them as soon as we get those transplants at the box stores and it's too cold. Well, we have a plant, but it never produced. Well, it accidentally was stunted because of the cold temperatures. So that is a challenge that we need to avoid. And it's just a simple thing is we're just wanting to be outside so bad. So it's easy to get excited. And so if you buy early, you're going to have to harden those plants anyway and baby them a little bit and take care of them until the soil temperature is right to transfer them out permanently into the garden. So it's always good to avoid early planting unless we know that the soil temperature is ready for it. Okay, next slide. This is a really handy chart that I found at Oregon State University Extension that gives us the minimum temperature for seeds to germinate via soil temperature. So it gives us an idea of what can be started early. And if you look at this chart, you'll see that onions and spinach and parsnips lettuce are all 35 degrees. If you look at our soil temperature data across the state, for the most part, we are past that minimum 35-degree threshold. So now would be a time to start those crops. Then we go up to the next level here, which is going to be beets, carrots, cabbage, cauliflower, Swiss chard, parsley, radishes. All of those are at 40 degrees. And according to our soil temperature data here at North Platte, we are close to that threshold now. Eastern Nebraska has already passed that time point. So they've already warmed up past 40. So we have the ability to go even further. So if you look at our map across the state, you will see warm and cold spots and that there is variation. So it's always good to know your local temperatures where they're at. It's also really good to know the optimum range for germination, which gives you an idea and why some crops do really well planting earlier because of that cool temperature. And notice that some crops will take a higher germination temperature than others. So this is just a really nice chart to do some compare and contrast and know which things could probably be planted earlier based off of our soil temperatures. Okay, next slide. Here's the data from our Crop Watch website, and this is a really good resource for us to have to look at. It is updated all the time in the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture through UNL Extension and the department. So this is a really good way to look at what are the temperatures doing in a couple different scenarios. So we have the daily 4-inch soil temperature, and then we have a weekly 4-inch. So we would like to see more consistent temperatures over time because that tells us that we have had consistently, this is what the temperature is. And then that helps us make a better decision to plant. So there will be days where the temperatures will be warmer than others and they will vary. So if we start to see that temperature stay at that certain range or higher, then that tells us that we're ready to plant something, and where it's consistent, and that's really important. The We can put that link in the chat. We also have it in our presentation, so it's really nice. And this is based off of years of data that the university has collected, so it's really good to have that data around for us to look at. So I really like using this as a reference for people if they do not have a soil thermometer to look, and you can go and see different parts of the state where these weather stations are located. So it may not be your literal hometown, but at least it's close. So that's really important for us. Okay, next slide. So here's the soil thermometer. This is the one that I purchased that I have in my hands right now. So you'll actually get to see the face of it on this slide. It's one of the best little $10 investments that you can make here from your local garden center or box store on how to collect soil temperature data. So you want to choose one location that you're going to test at, and you're going to choose one time to collect your data. So if you're going to measure your soil temperatures at 4 o'clock, you need to stay consistent and test at 4 o'clock each time to make sure that you have consistent time and location. So you want to insert the thermometer 4 inches deep. So here is the thermometer, and I have measured it out what 4 inches deep looks like. So you'll see the black band here. So that tells you that's 4 inches deep. So it's going to be over halfway into the soil. So that's good. You want to put that in. I usually shove it in at an angle, and where it goes 4 inches deep, a little bit of an angle, and then I wait for 10 minutes for it to calibrate and kind of settle down. Then I record my temperature. So you repeat those same steps over a minimum of 4 days. So you're going to go back to the same spot at the same time, going 4 inches deep for 4 days, and record your temperatures. And the next question is, are these temperatures fluctuating or are they staying the same? So if they're sitting right at 45 degrees fairly consistently across 4 days, then we can say, okay, now it is okay to plant our cabbage, our onions, our celery, and our peas, for instance. So that's how you use your soil thermometer. And it's also really good in a non-vegetable garden scenario. We are already getting questions about when to put on pre-emergence herbicide for our lawn weeds. Well, that is 55 degrees. You can still use your soil thermometer in your lawn to test when that right time is, so you have an effective use of your products. So it's more than just the vegetable garden. It can be used in a number of different scenarios, and it's just a great little investment. If you take care of it, keep it clean, and keep it free from damage, it's a great tool to use, and it'll help you from avoiding the guesswork. Okay, next slide. This is the frost-free date pattern across the state for Nebraska over years. I believe it's over 100 years of data that shows us where we have our average frost-free dates, which we call the 90% frost-free date in this case. So you can tell there are going to be areas that are warmer or cooler across the state, that it's not just set by your county borders. So if you look at Lincoln County here in southwest Nebraska, the big county where I'm located at, you see that it dips down into the central part of the county, and North Platte is just on the edge of that. So we are in this lighter second shade of blue. And so we always talk about May 15th being our average frost-free date. And that can vary because last year we had a late freeze. So it did happen. And so we know that we can have freezes after May 15th, but it gives us an idea. If you look one county to the west, that is bordering Colorado. That is Keith County, and the middle little dot here is the city of Ogallala, and it is a warm spot for some reason. So you have a warm spot there. That is an anomaly. And you will also look straight south of North Platte along the Kansas border in southwest Nebraska. You'll see where McCook is. We always joke about McCook being the hot spot of southwest Nebraska. Well, we've got some weather data that proves that. So McCook always seems to be a little warmer air temperature wise than the rest of the regions. So we've got that. So it's really good to know where you are within your county if you have a cold spot or a warm spot, and then that range of temperature when it comes to the average frost dates. So you'll have a lot of variability clear up to June 29th in far northwest Nebraska up in Sioux County, and then you go clear down south into very southeast Nebraska and Richardson County, where we're late April. So it can vary a lot across the state naturally. Then we have, this is our fall vegetable gardening neb guide, and I pulled this table that gives us a little bit of an idea what is going to be hardy and semi-hardy. And it works really good for our early crops to tell us what can withstand the really cold temperatures when temperatures go down to around 20 degrees. And so these are the ones that are really tough. So our cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts are crucifers. They are cold crops. Those are really cold. They like the cold. They do okay. Carrots, parsnips, rutabagas, and kale. So they will take that cold temperature. So if we do have a frost, that they will hang in there. And our next group would be some of our mustards here with, you have beets, you have Chinese cabbage, collards, our potatoes, Bibb lettuce, leaf lettuce, mustards, radishes, chard, and green onions. So these are the ones that we can get away with having some light frost without any problem. And then we are really cold troopers that will hang out if we have a really bad cold snap. So this is a great chart to look at also as well. So we align all this data and all these charts together, really handy. Okay, next slide. Then we have crop maturity, because we do have the ability to look at disease resistance and personal characteristics of cultivars that we personally care for on a production level or a taste, but also the maturity and the availability of plants to grow to maturity so we can harvest is also another major factor. So we have areas where we do have a shorter growing season, especially in western Nebraska, up in the Panhandle, where we can choose shorter maturing cultivars as a tool to help us get to harvest, just in case we do have that shorter growing season on the other end where we have that early frost. So we have to think of not only the cold in the beginning, but the cold potentially in the end. So we can play around with that maturity in our selection of our varieties as another tool in our belt for us to have success. Okay, next slide. This is for those who want to start seeds indoors. It's really good to look at this on the vegetable side to tell us when we need to start our process of getting seeds started, which we've talked about in previous GROBigRed classes, but we need to be able to count back. So when we count back, we use that 90% frost-free date as our starting point. And we look at this table from Purdue University Extension, how many weeks we need to go back at least to start our seeds indoors. And then we've got to add another 2 weeks for our transplants to harden. And what we mean by hardening is we have tacked on that extra time for those transplants to come outside during the day in a semi-protected environment to get acclimated to the wind and to the growing environment outdoors, and then we pull them back in at night. So over that 2 week span, we're taking them out first in a protected area and then pulling them back in. And as those 2 weeks progress, we pull them further and further out into the open exposure where they will be. And the idea is that this is going to reduce our transplant shock once we finally plant them into the ground. And so this is important whether we start our seeds indoors or whether we buy transplants at the box stores or the greenhouses. If we buy them from the greenhouse or the box stores, we need to harden them as well. So if you are excited about buying those transplants and you've got way too much time on your hands because you've got to wait, you might as well harden these plants really well before you transplant them anyway. So, and I understand, especially in some of our locations, we do not have a lot of variety and those selections get picked over. So go ahead and buy those plants that you like, your favorite varieties, and then harden them so then you can get them planted when the soil temperature is right and we're past that frost-free date if it's something that's very prone to freeze, because our tomatoes and our peppers and our eggplants, once again, our favorite family, is very prone to frost damage. So we can purchase our favorites, just take them in and out and get them hardened. And then we're ready to go once we get past the threat of the freeze and we get to that minimum 60-degree soil temperature to plant them in, for instance. Okay, next slide. So we talked about hardening already. It's a great process to reduce a lot of headaches and a lot of disappointment. And that helps us have stronger plants that are more resistant to the weather from the ups and the downs. And that still doesn't mean it's perfect, but it'll make them a lot tougher once we plant. If you've ever seen transplants that were planted straight from the box store, straight from the greenhouse, and they look awful wimpy out there, they're going through transplant shocks. So we want to make sure that they are nice and hardened. You can also do things such as wall of water or the milk jug around the plants if it's still pretty cool, even when the soil temperatures are warm. And we just have a cold blast or the wind is very strong. Of course, in Nebraska, the wind blows pretty much across the states. So those are nice little strategies to help toughen those plants up. And then we can help pull those walls of water and those jugs off to protect them. Or some people will plant into hollow buckets. You can just pull the bucket out and your plants are protected. Okay, next
David,
slide.
before we go on to the activity,
Sure.
um, we have a question. Would raised beds be a different temperature? And the answer is yes, because they warm up faster.
Yes,
So they,
the ground is
might,
an insulator.
right. So you might speed up things like 2 weeks or so, like by having a raised bed, the soil will be warmer.
Yes, that is true. And your buckets and your container gardens will also be warmer. So you can play with that versus a traditional garden. Your traditional garden in the ground serves as an insulator, and it'll keep the soil cooler than a raised bed or a container garden. Especially in our small container gardens will warm up really quick, but we still may get the cold winds that could do some damage. So we need to make sure that we have some protection. So that's where the wall of water or the cones or the milk jugs domes would be very beneficial. So you can do some manipulation. You can also solarizing in areas to help warm them up artificially, whether it be in ground or in raised beds with plastic. And then you can tell with your soil thermometer that it will warm it up a little quicker. When I presented in South Dakota, where we have a shorter growing season, even in Nebraska, and they want to get things started quicker, so they are solarizing the soil and warming that up so they have vegetables that will grow within a decent amount of time so they can harvest, but they need that time. So they're doing that manipulation ahead. And then they're also doing the extra protection that I've talked about so they can get things started so they can go through the full maturity to have the ability to harvest. So um, as we get into Wyoming and South Dakota, especially that the growing season's just not there and it just takes longer to warm up. So we deal with that on this end of the state. So that is another little trick that you can do. Okay, so here's a counting backwards example that I had literally set up for my garden here. We have a food pantry garden with Growing Together Nebraska. So we have to start our vegetables, especially our tomatoes, early. So our 90% frost-free date is May 15th. So we're going to use our table from Purdue University. It says 7 weeks for tomatoes to grow as seedlings. And then we're going to add the 2-week hardening period. So we're going to start with May 15th. That is our frost-free date. Everything's ready to be everything's hardened off and ready to go on May 15th. So we're going to take 1 day back. So we're going to go May 14th. And then we're going to start counting back weeks. And what I have is my little desk calendar here that I use. And I have my calendar here set up. So I want to show everyone what I do here is I've got it set up. So May 14th on my calendar. And then I start counting backwards on the days. So this is 1 week, and I just keep on growing back. And so I will mark 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks as I flip backwards on my tabs, and it'll tell me that I need to plant February 5th. And I've got my 9 written down here on my calendar. So that tells me that I had to seed back in early February on my tomatoes in the greenhouse at North Platte, so I could have them ready, hardened and ready to go if the soil temperature is at 60 degrees and we're past the frost-free date. So that's one way of using that. So you always look at your date and then you go backwards 1 day. So you go the full day and then you start counting weeks back. So that's a really good little example of surprising how early you have to start on some of these vegetables. So that's something to remember, and that's why we wanted to share that with you. I also have it in my worksheet as well that I'll be showing here in a little bit. Okay, next slide.
I think it's also good to remember that you don't have to run out and plant all of those on the frost-free date.
No,
Like
no,
you can plant tomatoes up until like June or even maybe even early July. So you don't have to start in February. You can start them now or you can start them even later.
I just have them set up so my examples, so we're ready to go. And like I said, that's an if we are ready for 60-degree temperatures on May 15th and we're past the frost. So we are ready to go. So that is the earliest scenario for my situation. So like John said, you can plant later, but you also need to know how many days you have maturity wise on your cultivars to make sure that you'll be able to harvest and have a bountiful harvest at the end before the fall freeze comes. So our other example would be North Platte again, and we're going to look at our green beans, for example. And we have a variety that I tried last year in the garden at home. I liked it. It's called Kitchen King. It's a variety from the local farm store that I used. And so our example is, okay, let's use the May 15th date. So that's our time that tells us. And when we get to 60 degrees, we are ready to plant our beans. So it's warm enough. So it says 55 days to maturity. And then we have 14 days for our harvest period that we tack on. So we tack on 14 days to harden our transplants, and we tack on 14 days for a harvest period. So at least we have some time to be able to harvest. And that's really important for our longer maturing vegetables, because just because they're ready to mature right at the very end, you hope to have some time to be able to harvest with. So we start with May 15th on our calendar here. So May 15th is our first day. So our first full day would be May 16th. And notice that I've got a 1 here started. So that's our first day. And then we're working our way forward. So we're going to count forward, starting with May 16th, counting 55 days, plus another 14 days. So that tells us our harvest window is July 9th through 23 for this vegetable, for this type of green bean. Gives us an idea. And you can also continue harvesting your green beans if you will continuously pick them, because they will continuously produce. So it's not like it's going to be 2 weeks and they're done. You can, if you keep harvesting them, keep them healthy, they'll keep on producing beans for you. So that's an example of counting forward. So that's a good one to use. So we're using our frost-free date basically as a rule of thumb, not hard and fast, but a good general rule of thumb. And we're looking at our temperature data saying, okay, the temperature meets up with a good time. It's a crop that's would be damaged by frost if we got a frost. So we're working ahead. And this is one that's great for relay planting. So, okay, so maybe we plant the first row on May 15th. Maybe we can wait another week and we'll have another row planted. So we'll relay plant, and so we'll have another harvest coming a little later. So if you do 3 relays of 3 different planting weeks, you can have a really nice succession of this crop. And if you keep on harvesting those green beans, you'll have a really nice flush of beans throughout a stretch of the gardening season. Also, when we did our fall planting, in our case, we learned how to count backwards to do a fall bean harvest, a fall bean crop as well. So this is one of those you can have spring and fall. So that's something important. There's a comment about the 10-day family vacation. Yes, you can settle your planting dates kind of knowing whether it's going to fall during that time to harvest or not. So you do have the ability to do some of that manipulation. That's really important, because when green beans are ready to pick, you better pick them. So
Yeah.
that's
And I
one of
was
those.
going to
There's not a lot of leeway. You got to get them picked.
say that, and I was going to say, this is really handy for the fall crop to see, do I have enough time to plant this? Maybe I have extra beans and I want to plant them in July for a fall crop. If I count, do I have enough time to get them done before my frost date?
Mm-hmm.
And so this method can be used then.
You'll find out that you start maybe a little sooner than what you originally anticipate. It's like, okay, then I need to go back enough time to be able to have that fall crop and to have enough time to harvest, because not only you have the harvest window to figure out, you also have what we call cold factor on the other end, meaning that the heat units are dropping on the late summer into fall, so things are not going to mature as fast. So there's some further manipulation. So that's what's fun about this class, is that you've learned some tools on how to manipulate to get around the vacation, have multiple crops going, relaying, and then also counting backwards so you can have some things ready in the fall, because the heat units cool down in the fall and the sugars develop into our vegetables, so they have a really nice sweet flavor.
Yeah. And so you created a worksheet that folks can use, and I just put that link in the chat where folks can plan, around their specific crop. So we can talk about that. If you have more questions, we have about 7 minutes left. So feel free to type those in the chat. So
here is my worksheet that I put together. It is 5 pages in length, and it is colors because